Good morning. Okay, this video is going to cover Genesis chapter 4 and possibly Genesis chapter 5 because chapter 5 is pretty much just a list of a genealogy type list. Begat, begat, begat. I don't think it's actually that terminology, but that's all. That is almost all that it is. So we may go through that quickly. It ties in well with this and sort of wraps up this section and of stories and moves into the next section. It wraps up the Adam and Eve portion and then moves into, well, the Noah portion is going to be the next section of the Bible. Before we start chapter 4, I wanted to mention maybe two things. I wrote them down that I left off last night. One of them I mentioned during the video that I would say something at the end of last night's video regarding a correspondence between one of the events that we were covering and something in the New Testament. I forgot to do that. As it turns out, that is going to be fine because it will come up again today in chapter 4 here, that correspondence or the next level of that correspondence. So it works out well, but I will just go ahead and mention it briefly, and then we will touch on it again when we get to that part here in chapter 4. I will point this out regularly, as I already have several times in this series. I will point it out for a little while longer because this next thing. Okay, so it is about the structure of the Bible, about the structure of the literary narrative part of the Bible. As I have said before, the Old Testament is a, well, I'm not sure how far I have gone in this story, but the Old Testament and the New Testament are parallel in a lot of ways. The New Testament sort of retells a lot of the Old Testament, but at a different level. I mean, not retells the same story in terms of the same people and everything, but the events and so on sort of reoccur in a higher way. But there's also another sort of structure that I have mentioned, and that's sort of the bookending structure, where something that happens early in the Old Testament happens late in the New Testament. And the next thing that happens, so just say it this way, it's not always literally exactly this, but it's pretty much like this. The first thing that happens in the Old Testament is the last thing that happens in the New. And then the second thing in the Old Testament is the second to last, the penultimate, in the New. And the third is the third from the last. And the fourth is the fourth from the last, and so on. So there's this bookending structure, this sort of parallelism that is a hallmark of the structure of well-crafted stories, something like that. Outside of the Bible, stories that kind of work that way. There's this parallel structure that's sort of beautiful, stylistic way. It's a way of adding meaning, of adding something like meaning to the story, but not in the narrative, but in the structure of the narrative. Anyway, the Bible is just this beautifully crafted narrative of reality that it's just beautiful. So I will point out a couple of those things today. Both, I think, the sort of parallel conceptual repetitions, but in different levels, at different levels. I think I'll talk about that a little bit. Well, I will. But then also this structure. Now, what this structure, this bookending structure, what is happening a lot of times is in the Old Testament, we are seeing this sort of decline. So we start in paradise, we start in the Garden of Eden, and we decline and we go away from the Garden of Eden. And then in the New Testament, we start going back up. So these bookends are kind of something happens in the old, and then it's undone in the new. And so, right, so we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps of decline in the old, and then these 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 steps of undoing the decline in the new, right? So there's this structure like that. And so I just want to briefly allude to one of those things right now. It has to do with the second death, and I do also want to repeat this because this will come up. This is an important concept to have throughout the Bible. This idea of two deaths. There is the physical death and the spiritual death. Implied in chapter 2 last night. Yeah, I will start losing track of which chapters things are in soon. But in chapter 2, when God told Adam not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Well, when they did eat of that tree, Adam and Eve, they did not physically die, so that implies something else must be going on. And now you can read that in a more physical way by saying, well, they didn't die that day, but death came into the world and they will now die, whereas they would not have died before. However, there are places in the Bible where two deaths, in fact, the second death and so on, are explicitly mentioned, and I think it is much better to view it that way because the two are intimately tied together. In a sense, it is the spiritual death that is sort of paramount is paramount, and in fact, it is the spiritual death that without the spiritual death, there can be no physical death, which is something that the Bible will unfold, will be revealed as the Bible goes along. Before I continue there, I also have pointed out a couple of times that I would not be interpreting the Bible in terms of the New Testament. And that is true, but I mean it in a certain way. I have thought about this overnight, and I will actually be referencing the New Testament a fair amount, as I am doing right now, in regard to sort of the way this story is put together and the beautiful parallelisms and structures and so on. So I will be referencing it in that way, but in my mind, I think of that differently than interpreting in terms of the New Testament. There are a lot of interpretational versions of commentary that I do not generally go along with as much. I'm not saying that they cannot be interesting. They can be, but they can also be overdone, as can what I'm doing. Anything can. But what I mean by that is I will not be saying, I cannot give an example of this at the moment, although we will come across them, and then maybe I'll just point out what I'm talking about here. But I will not be claiming that something that happened in the Old Testament happened specifically to, I don't know how to say this exactly because I kind of don't want to push what I'm saying too hard, but its real meaning is something that no one would have understood until the New Testament happened, and then it had meaning. Right, so I see history as unfolding, and then the New Testament as undoing it. Not that God is not in control the whole time, and we mean something by that, which eventually we'll get to. Probably in Joshua is when we will really start talking about what that means. But so anyway, I hope it becomes clear about what I mean. I will be referencing the New Testament, I suppose, a fair amount, but I will not be interpreting, and that may not be clear. I will not be interpreting the Old Testament. I hope I'm saying that right, in terms of the New Testament. It's almost like there's a way of reading the Old Testament with an entirely different meaning when you interpret it through the New Testament, as opposed to something like the way I'm going to be talking about it is this sort of beautiful plan of God, that the sovereignty of God is so wonderful and amazing that that history just lays itself out in such a way so that there is this parallelism and so on. Anyway. Okay, let me move on from this. Now I forgot what I was talking about, the second death thing. So let me try and get back on track with that. Okay, so the second. So yesterday, one other thing to get used to when reading the Bible, and actually any literature, really, biblical or not, is understanding connections in a less than extremely over rationalized sense. Okay. Okay. Bear with me for a few minutes here in this video, hopefully, and we will get past this. But so let me give an example of what I'm talking about. This idea of the second death, or of two deaths. What the way that I think is better to interpret the meaning of "in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die" is based on what happened. What happened in the day that they ate of it was they left the garden. I said yesterday that essentially when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because that was against God's will, because that was not God's will, they essentially walked right out of the garden. Well, what is the one of the main things in the garden, I would say in a sense the main thing because of what it means, is the tree of life. Not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but the tree of life. So when they walk out of the garden, they lose access to the tree of life. In fact, let me scroll this up here. The chapter ends pointing that out very explicitly. There are both these cherubim guarding the way into the garden, and then there is also this flaming sword turning every way to guard the way to the tree of life. I mean, it's very explicit that what has happened is that Adam and Eve have lost access to the tree of life. Well, what happens if you lose access to the tree that gives life? That's the same as death. So in the day that they eat of it, they lose access to life. That's death. That is death, right? So in some sense, if you can argue with that, you can quibble with that and say, well, okay, but that's not exactly, I mean, it wasn't that day. Like, that is getting, you will find it impossible to understand the Bible and essentially great literature, great movies, great everything if you insist on being so overly literal. That is not how literature is written. That is not how humans communicate. So I think this is a kind of a good example to begin to try to wrap your mind around that way of thinking. It should be very clear to you, I'm going to say, even if I were wrong in this example, like even if that actually, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, meant something else, even if this is wrong, the method, the sort of overall idea that I'm talking about here of reading in a certain way, that is not wrong. You absolutely should develop the skill to read in that way. And maybe it's just me because I am a very technical, overly analytical person. So maybe other people do this perfectly naturally. Most people, some do and some don't. But so maybe I'm overemphasizing this point because it's my problem. I know that's true. Maybe it's not yours, and good for you. But when reading the Bible, that type of reading will be very necessary. And to be clear, I am not saying that the literal reading is always wrong. I'm saying you need to develop a palette of skills, and you need to be able to read in all these different levels and find the meaning, or more often meanings, because these are brilliantly written texts, and they have multiple meanings, multiple levels, ambiguity and concreteness. You know, it's just beautifully, it's masterfully written. And so, okay, so hopefully that makes sense in an obvious way if you don't overanalyze it. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. That is exactly what happened. They lost access to the tree of life. That if you lose access to life, you lose access to death. I mean, if you lose access to life, that is death. So clear, not actually that, pretty straightforward, I would say. Now, what I wanted to point out regarding the parallel in the New Testament is that, so I think it's clear at this point. I've pointed out that that what happens in the New Testament is the undoing of the fall in the Old Testament. So at the end of the New Testament, I've mentioned before that the Bible begins in the Garden of Eden and it essentially ends in the Garden of Eden. Now, when I say Garden of Eden, it is not literally the exact same geographical location on the Garden of Eden. Once again, try to understand what I mean when I say that. Say things like that. It is a return to what is the Garden of Eden. It is a temple. It is the presence of God. Even the tree of life. The tree of life is not, don't think of it as a literal tree with roots in the ground and apples or oranges or whatever on it. That's not, the tree of life is a narrative representation of what is available to us when we are in the presence of God. In other words, the Garden of Eden is a place where God walks. In other words, it is a place where we have access, communion, connection, unification sort of with God. One of the things that is available in such a situation where man and God are in communion is eternal life. That is represented narratively as a tree from which you could eat fruit and it would sustain you eternally. But what it really means is that you have communion, access, connection with God. And so at the end of the Bible, that communion, that restoration of that reunification of heaven and earth, heaven, God, again, this is another example of exactly what I was saying, and I won't keep repeating this, but I'm trying to make the point now. If I say heaven and earth, that I mean exactly what I would mean if I said God and man are in communion in the Garden of Eden. It's all the same thing. That's what that means. And so in the end of the Bible, this is restored, and the Bible ends in the way that it begins, except at the end, it's a higher state than in the beginning, because I talked about yesterday how I see the narrative is presented as though Adam and Eve are infants, something like that, or toddlers, but young. And then the Bible is going to be the stage of development, and then we end up back with God in the garden, however you want to phrase it. It's also, at the end, it's also called the new heaven and the new earth. It's called the new Jerusalem, but you can call it the new garden. It's the garden, those are all the same thing. But at the end, we've been through all of this process, and we are back in the garden, but this time mature, not as toddlers, but as mature humans that properly reflect God, that as properly we are capable and actually performing our proper role as the image and as the image of God and made in the likeness of God. So it's done at the proper thing. So we are living properly. And so one thing that implies, or is, well, yeah, it implies, is that at some point, if that is the way that the Bible ends, in other words, that is the eternal state, that is God's plan. God's plan will not be thwarted. God is God. He will not be thwarted. So if that's the way it ends, then that's the way God plans for it to end. And so that's proper is what I'm getting at, because it's God's will. And so at that point, though, man clearly does have the knowledge of good and evil. So it seems quite clear to me from knowing the ending. Now, you would not know this from knowing the beginning, but if you also know the ending, then it's clear that mankind would have been given at some point, would have been given access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because in the final state, as presented in the Bible, in Revelation at the end, and implied previous to that, but at the end, mankind does clearly have the knowledge of good and evil. So all of this stuff went wrong and then had to be corrected through God's plan of salvation. But had it not gone wrong, presumably we would have ended up in the same eternal state, but just would not have had to go through all the suffering and pain in between. But if that's God's final plan, or if that's the finality of God's plan, then we would have presumably ended up there without the suffering, though. But we would, in other words, have the knowledge of good and evil. So what I'm getting at is, one thing to understand, especially if you hear criticisms of this type of many of these things, a lot of these criticisms can be addressed with some ideas that you can sort of pull out from the text, like this. Well, the Bible is this. Anyway, the Bible is this story of development, and it seems quite clear, because of this is just another example of what I'm saying, that there is this change in the beginning, and it's why you can't read the beginning the same as the end. In other words, just because God says in Genesis 2 that you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that doesn't mean later in the Bible that statement equally holds. This is kind of part of what I was talking about last night. Like, you can't it's a story of development. So once you get past a certain stage of development, the earlier things may change, in the same way that you might give rules to a child at age 2 that you will not give to your 16-year-old child, right? The same child, it's just a difference in development. And so different statements, different rules would apply. And it's not that the 2-year-old rules were wrong, and so they never should have been there or something. It's just that they applied at that stage of development, but different rules apply at this stage of development. And so the Bible is like that. Some things from 2-year-old, maybe some rules do apply throughout your entire life. So some do, some don't. It's all a matter of wisdom. It's discussed throughout the Bible. Things are explicitly changed, implicitly changed, etc. But there is this developmental structure to the narrative of the Bible. One more thing I wanted to mention about that, the second death part. What was it? Oh, it was the actual correspondence with the New Testament. So pretty much what we've read so far is that, or the last major thing that we read was Adam and Eve lost access to the tree of life. In other words, they lost access to God. In other words, they died the spiritual death. They no longer have access to eternal life, to the tree of life. They no longer have direct access to God, all saying the same thing. That will be undone in the New Testament, right? Because Adam and Eve act outside of God's will and lose access to eternal life. They die the spiritual death. Jesus will spend his entire life completely inside the will of God, and he will reopen the door. That is essentially what happens. I'll just say it in that sort of metaphorical way, although that's exactly the way Jesus says it in the New Testament. So we will see that when we get to the Gospels, and Revelation. But Jesus, through obedience to God's will undo what happened with Adam in disobedience to God's will. Jesus will reopen the door into the garden. The sword will be taken away, will be removed, etc. So anyway, Jesus's obedience to God's will reopen the door to the tree of life, will reopen access to God, will reopen access to eternal life. In other words, it will undo this, and so it's this. So that's the story of the Bible. That's how it's told. And so that brings us to chapter 4, which is going to be primarily, or the part that I'm going to focus on, is about sacrifice. And what's going to happen is exactly chapter 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is disobedience and the fall and loss of access to the tree of life. Chapter 4 is going to be about sacrifices, both proper and improper. And then, in particular, though, what plays out here is the improper sacrifice. And then in the New Testament, Jesus is going to do two things. He's going to not live in disobedience to God's will, but obedience to God's will. And he's going to reestablish the proper sacrifice that fails here in chapter 4. He's going to reestablish the proper sacrifice as part of his life of obedience, and that will undo, right? So it's the reversal. Here in 3 and 4, we have disobedience and the improper sacrifice, and then at the end of, or in the New Testament, we have obedience and the proper sacrifice, and that reopens the door to eternal life, to God, etc. It defeats it. You'll hear that if you're around Christian. You'll hear that Jesus defeated sin and death. Sin just being disobedience to God's will. So Jesus defeats sin and death. This is that. This is the undoing of the death that Adam and Eve just experienced at the end of chapter 3. That's what Jesus does. He undoes it. Okay, so chapter 4. One final thing. When I say things like that, obviously I am not giving a lot of the details. We will get to some of those details when we get to the Gospels and Acts and Revelation. I think those are in this narrative story of the Bible. Actually, well, before I mention that, let me finish this before I forget, which I already did, but I'm thinking very quickly, thinking. I forgot. I do that to myself all the time. Okay, so, but I think what I'm going to do in this narrative section, this is my thought that I had overnight. I may only cover about 20 books in this series, in this narrative portion of the series. It will be, most of them will be the opening 14, something like that, 14 books of the Old Testament, which are the narrative portions. I'll skip a couple in there, but it's about 14 or maybe 16. 14, I think. Yeah, it would be 14, I think, I'm pretty sure. And then the 4 Gospels and Acts and Revelation, so 6 in the New Testament. And that is pretty much the direct narrative portion. There are some other narrative stories in the Bible, and I may talk about some of them. And I may make separate sort of individual videos on something like Job I would love to talk about. And then there's the issue, and then there are the prophets and the wisdom literature, which includes Job. But I'm thinking, actually, I was thinking this series will take a while, but it may not be quite as long as I was thinking, because the narrative portion that I'm trying to talk about here will not cover all 66 books. It's pretty much in 20. If you do there was a lot of repetition in the others. So if you cover those 20, I think if we cover those 20, I think we can get the story of the Bible, because my goal in this first pass, this presentation, is to try to communicate the story, so that then once you get the story in mind, I think then you can really read it for depth once you have the flow of what's going on. And so I think this is what I said I forgot a minute ago. So what I'm trying to do here is, when I talk about the New Testament, and I'm not giving the details, I'm just trying to give you an outline of the story, so that as you're reading these chapters on your own, and the Bible on your own, it doesn't feel like you're lost, like you have no idea why this applies or how this would have any meaning or where it's going, which I don't know how you can't read it that way if you don't have a basic idea of the structure, the overall story. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not giving the details of how things happen in the New Testament, and maybe we are going into some detail in the Old, but I'm trying to point out where it's headed, so that you can sort of not feel lost as you're reading. At least that's my intent. I hope it works that way, to give you an overall comfort, familiarity with the story that you're reading, so that you can really read it and really get deeper meaning out of it, because you're not stuck at the shallower level of trying to figure out what in the world is even going on. You've kind of got that down, and you can go deeper. Okay. Now, So, chapter 4. Now Adam knew his wife. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Okay, so what is happening here is we are beginning to enter. Remember, in these first 11 chapters of the Bible, we are creating the world in this primeval way, primeval history, kind of mythological history, whatever you want to think of. We are creating the world. And so at this point, up until now, the only people have been Adam and Eve, who were specially created by God. These are the first two people that the Bible talks about. It's not necessary that they are. One more thing that brings up one more thing, which we will see in the very next chapter more explicitly. But the Bible often mentions specifically the people that it is then going to talk about. That does not mean, and it is clearly the case, that there are, for instance, in this type of thing, many other things that happen and many other children, for instance, here. But in this case, Cain and Abel are going to be, and I'm not saying anything about whether they had children before, after, whatever. That's the story is trying to tell us something, and what I am concerned with is what the story is trying to tell us, not putting together, as I said the other day, I'm not discussing this in a historical way, was this really that, or that. I have no interest in that. What I have interest in here, especially, is in these primeval stories, is what is being communicated. And what is being communicated here in the first couple, very simply, there's not a whole lot yet, is that we have moved into we're progressing into the story where now we are beginning to have people being born naturally in the way that we would recognize. So the earth is going, so the world is, reality itself is going to keep getting, in these 11 chapters, keep getting closer and closer to what we recognize. And then at the end of the 11th chapter, it will be the world that we pretty much recognize, the ancient world, but the world we recognize. And then the story will sort of restart, or the actual story of salvation history, the story of the Bible, will begin. And so these are the first people actually born, like us, that were, that's what's being communicated here. We're moving into a new phase. And again, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Another continuation of development and continuing to progress to the world that we know. We're now splitting into different professions. You have farmers and you have herders or shepherds, etc. So the world is expanding. Remember back in chapter 1, where God created man and woman, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That's what's happening here. The earth is now being filled. This is spreading out. So we're getting more and more like what the world that we actually recognize, so that the story can then begin. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Okay, I almost wish this was not the case, but I cannot deny one of the ideas that I use to interpret what I'm reading. I mentioned a couple of times yesterday that the Bible is not a closed caption security camera, or a I suppose it is closed caption. Well, that's a good question. CCTV, closed caption security. Anyway, the Bible is not a security camera, just capturing things sort of with no meaning or purpose. The Bible is just capturing events, no matter how mundane or inane. That's not what's happening here. What is written here is intentionally written here, and what is not written here is intentionally not written here. Especially when you see two sentences or parts of sentences or verses in very close proximity to each other, structured similarly, but one says something and one does not. Now, this is interpretation. It does not mean that it means this, but one of my basic rules, not a hard and fast rule, you must obey it, but it is this idea of what is obviously not in there is probably obviously not in there to mean something. What I'm talking about here is the way that this talks about Cain's sacrifice and Abel's sacrifice. So in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering, or I should say an offering, rather than sacrifice. Sacrifice is a perfectly fine word, but until we talk about it, especially when we get to Leviticus, maybe I should probably say offering, which is the word used here, for a reason that may become clear when we talk about this. Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. Okay, when we read that, apparently no problem. Cain is offering something to God, offering something of his produce. Cain is a farmer and he produces and he offers something to God. Fine, nothing necessarily to see wrong so far. But the next part of the sentence, and Abel also brought, but it doesn't just say an offering of his flock. It says, it gets more specific, more obviously specific. Also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. The fat portions, too, in the ancient world, that would have clearly meant something. The fat portions would be the something like a more valuable part. So to the ancient world, this would clearly, the firstborn and the fat portions are clearly valuable offerings. And so it's explicitly pointing out here that Abel brought valuable portions of his produce is not quite the right word, I guess, but of his belongings. Abel brought valuable offerings, and Cain brought an offering. Doesn't say unvaluable, but it specifically says that Abel's is extra valuable. So that probably implies that Cain's was not. Doesn't mean it was bad, it just means it wasn't special. In other words, Cain did not necessarily, this seems to imply, Cain did not necessarily bring the best. He didn't go out of his way to bring the best, at least. Whereas it appears that Abel probably did. There's a part of me that wishes it was not written that way, because I want to add some additional meaning to this. I actually would like it a little better myself if there were more ambiguity. Now, to be fair, people have read this ambiguously as a somewhat ambiguous statement in the past, and it doesn't explicitly say that Cain brought less than his best. So it does not say he did bring less than his best. But given the rule that I think is a fairly useful rule in reading the Bible and other texts, it seems pretty clear that the Bible here is at pains to point out that Abel did bring the best, and it's in the same sentence that it does not point that out about Cain. So I think it probably is indicating that. Now, it still has the meaning I want it to mean, but I think to people who aren't familiar with reading a lot of this, reading deeply into this, it appears to sort of solve a problem that I don't think it actually does do, sort of. Okay, what I mean is, for a lot of people, so let's read the next part. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So God had no regard for Cain's and had regard for Abel, so he essentially accepts Abel's offering and rejects Cain's offering. There is a historical question about why. Why did God accept Abel's and reject Cain's? I kind of wish it were even more ambiguous. I think it would make the point I think this is making even better, but whatever. I'm probably wrong because I am not brilliant enough to be the writer of the Bible. But so what will happen? So I think what happens here is, see, I think the question, I think my point here is that I think we really need to focus. I think that's what this passage is about: proper and improper sacrifice. And I think it, by sort of making it semi-clear that, well, Abel offered the proper sacrifice and Cain did not. In other words, Abel offered the best of his goods, and Cain did not. And by understanding that, it's kind of almost easy to, okay, well, that's what this means. Offer the best of your goods, and that's the proper sacrifice. And then you kind of just can move on to the next story, because there's not, I kind of like it when there's more ambiguity in question, because it makes you stop and really wrestle with the text. And in my mind, that would be a little bit better, rather than sort of providing kind of the answer for you. I think it works. A lot of times I often enjoy the ambiguity and the difficulty of wrestling with the text and trying to figure out, okay, what exactly does this mean? How does it mean that? Why would it mean that? Does it fit with everything else in the Bible? What must it mean? If ever, I like that. I think it embeds the lessons and everything in your mind much more clearly. Now, I don't think it's a different lesson. I just think that don't let the sort of simplicity, the apparent simplicity of an answer, or something like that, don't let that just encourage you to read right over it because you understand this text. So let's now, next paragraph or something like that. Because even though there's this sort of quick answer to the question, why did God accept Abel's sacrifice and reject Cain's? Well, because Abel offered the first fruits, and Cain, Abel offered the best of his goods. Cain offered something less than that. So that's why. Well, okay, yeah, but what does that really mean? And why would you have to offer the best? And what is that? Anyway, we really need to think about this. And so what's happening here is this idea of offering is another one of the motifs that is going to be ever present in the Bible, literally from beginning to end. This idea of offering to God in the proper way and the improper way is going to be, the Bible is filled with this discussion. In other words, this is almost the central thing to figure out in the Bible. This is the way back into the garden, which makes sense because this is the first story after leaving the garden, right? So these are the first people. This is the first story outside the garden. And it is introducing the problem that we need to solve in order to get back into the garden. What I'm saying here is, in the New Testament, Jesus will finally offer the proper sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice, and that is the key, something like the key that opens the door back into the Garden of Eden. So the entire Bible is going to be about this idea of sacrifice. The entire Bible, explicitly. Unlike some things that are implicit, the idea of sacrifice, of offering, is constant throughout the Bible and is the pinnacle event of the Bible for Christians. The symbol of Christianity is a cross, which is the sacrifice, the offering of Jesus, of himself, as the perfect sacrifice. In other words, the first, and once he does that, the next thing that happens is re-entry into is the resurrection. After the crucifixion, the cross, is the resurrection. The resurrection is the restoration of eternal life. So the first story after exiting the Garden of Eden is improper sacrifice. The last story before re-entering the Garden of Eden into eternal life is the proper sacrifice. So this is, once again, that sort of bookending that I was talking about, the tunk, 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 the undoing, these events that occur in an order in the Old Testament, and then they occur in the reverse order, getting undone in the New Testament. That's this. So hopefully, anyway, it's just so beautiful. I love this. The Bible is just such a brilliant story. Okay, so throughout the entire Bible, that's going to be the whole point. I'm not going to go deeply into what is the proper sacrifice and everything right now, because that is literally the entire Bible, and Jesus demonstrates it as the pinnacle event in the New Testament. So I won't focus too heavily on it right now, because that's the entire Bible, proper sacrifice. You can think of it, and so there will be words that are used nearly interchangeably, different nuances. So you pick a different word depending upon what nuance you want to communicate in the particular statement you're making at the time. Just like I may say at sometimes it may be a little more useful for me to say the reconnection of heaven and earth. Other times it may be more useful to say return to the Garden of Eden. Other times it may be more useful to say access to the presence of God or something. But those are all saying the same thing, but by saying them in one of those ways, it maybe communicates something a little bit differently. Well, there's a similar idea with the idea of a sacrifice or an offering, or I had another one in my head. There are a bunch of different ways of saying that same thing. Sometimes you may call it a sacrifice, sometimes you may call it an offering, depending upon the nuance you want to communicate. So I will often, sometimes I just do it because in my head I'm focused on one of them and I use it when maybe I should have used the other. But anyway, for our purposes right now, we will get to the nuance difference and so on between them, but I will just probably switch back and forth often between sacrifice and offering right now until we're at a point where I'm really trying to make a distinction between what I'm talking about, and then I'll try to be a lot more careful about which word I'm using. But the point is here, the overall, what's happening throughout Genesis 1 to 11 here is that, and that'll start to become really clear in just a couple of paragraphs. We are witnessing I was going to say slow decline, but actually pretty quick decline of humanity, of the world, away from the Garden of Eden. The world is very quickly becoming unparadise-like. So, and that's what these 11 chapters are about, this descent away from God, away from the garden, away from eternal life. Okay, so as I said, we won't discuss why Cain's offering, what that means exactly that Cain did not offer his best, but we will get to that, and especially actually later. I said Leviticus, we'll talk about that a lot, but later when we get to Abraham, the story of Abraham, and in particular the sacrifice of Isaac, we will really talk about the proper sacrifice. Though that's the beginning of the story, that's still in Genesis. We have the entire Bible to talk about the proper sacrifice, but that is one point where that is what it's about. Though, like I said, the whole Bible, very explicitly, but the whole Bible is. So, okay. So, but again, one more time, offering is a constant motif throughout the Bible and the entire. Oh, I know one thing I was going to say. I think Robert Barron, Bishop Barron, a Catholic bishop, he says something like the Bible is about, or life is about, something like proper worship or correct praise, or another way of saying those things is proper offering, proper sacrifice, something like that. So anyway, the whole Bible will be about regaining entry into eternal life. In other words, regaining communion with God. And that is done through the proper offering, which means something. It doesn't mean God is just wants us to give everything to him because he's greedy or something. It has nothing to do with what offering means. Though if you don't understand the Bible, what it's talking about or its purpose, then it may appear that way. God is just this greedy God who wants us to bow down and give him things. That has nothing to do with what it means. And we'll get to more of that because there will be some difficulty here, although I think it's beautiful and not, well, I shouldn't say not difficult, but we will get to some challenging things to understand when we get to the Abraham story with the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay. But for Cain, his offering had no regard, so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." Okay, I think a lot of this is going to be pretty quick, just reading through, maybe point out a couple things here. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" You might read that as God's acceptance, which we don't know exactly what that means here yet. What does that mean? He had regard for Abel's sacrifice, for Abel's offering, and not for Cain's. Like, okay, but what does that mean? What did Abel get out of it, or what did Cain not get out of it, or whatever? Am I going to talk about that now at all? I think I'll talk about that as the Bible develops, I think, more. Although maybe I'll mention just one little thing briefly. But why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? Well, you might read that as God saying access to him, his approval. That sounds bad right now, but it doesn't mean what it sounds like. But being accepted by God, put it that way, being accepted by God is open to Cain. You might read that as it's open to everyone. It's open to, like, the improper sacrifice, in other words, was an improper sacrifice on Cain's part. It was not an arbitrary decision of God rejecting Cain for some arbitrary reason. This seems to be saying that Cain chose to offer poorly. But if he offered properly, then he would be accepted. That's what they're saying. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Or it seems to be saying that. And if you do not do well, so this is actually why I might talk about this now, although as the Bible unfolds, it will become more clear. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Okay, so this is one of those things, I guess I will talk a little briefly about this. The reason I don't like saying it the way I sort of said it, is where God did not accept Cain's sacrifice, is that's not the way to think about it, actually. That would be sort of like thinking in the previous chapter when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and they were punished, quote unquote. It would be like thinking of that punishment as God getting angry and throwing lightning bolts at them or something. But I described there that that's not what's happening. That's not what that means. Reality is structured in such a way so that if you bring corruption into reality, the consequences are bad. And that is exactly how you would want the world to be created, because, as I said, you don't want the consequences of bringing evil into the world to be good. That would encourage you to bring more evil into the world, right? That just wouldn't be correct. Now, the catch is they are good, right? The being bad, you have to get your mind around what all this means. The catch is that the bad, quote unquote, bad consequences that happen when you bring evil into the world, those actually are good consequences because it's exactly what you would want, right? So it's this strength. So that has a meaning in the way that, like, disciplining your child because you love them is this almost, depending upon how you speak those words, it may sound paradoxical. You're going to cause pain and suffering to your child because you love them, right? On the surface level, if you don't use at least some element of wisdom and maturity in understanding that, it can sound contradictory, but it's not at all. And that's kind of what this means. Or kind of what I'm talking about here, when I say the negative consequences of bringing corruption into the world, those aren't actually negative consequences. They're beautiful consequences, because you would want them to be painful, just like you want a child to be or an adult for that matter, to be disciplined properly, which is going to cause suffering and pain, but you discipline not in order to cause the suffering and pain, but in order to correct the path. And so that is the way to read what's happening here. So what's happening here is when Cain brings the wrong offering, or a bad offering, which I will talk a little bit about very briefly, and we'll introduce the idea and then we'll reinforce it throughout the entire reading of the Bible. When Cain brings the wrong offering, it is not that God looks down from heaven or something, sees the offering, turns his nose up at it, and then punishes Cain or something. That is in no way, shape, or form what is happening. What is happening is something like our proper role in reality is the thing that makes us, that fulfills us, the thing that we gain the most purpose from, the most meaning, the thing that gives us life, that brightens our eyes, is to walk in alignment with God's will. When you do that, it is different than anything else in a deep way. It is the path to, it is literally the path to God. It is the path to true happiness. It is the path to eternal life. And I mean that not in a live forever sense. I mean it in a way of actually being alive. If you kind of catch the drift there, I don't have the words to express what I mean quite yet. Oh, I just thought of another thing that I will say. But when Cain brings so going back to the idea of hierarchy that we talked about, we all have a value system, and we value certain things above other things. And when Cain offers something less than the best to God, what that is going to end up meaning, as we will discover what this means, and we will discover what this means as we go along, but what that is going to mean is Cain is putting something above God. If God were if living in alignment with God's will, which just, okay, there's a lot to say here, and we'll just have to unpack it as we learn more and more. But if God were at the top of Cain's value hierarchy, in other words, if God were who Cain loved the most, then he would offer his best to God. The fact that he does not offer his best to God it can mean nothing else, that God loves something other than God more than God. In other words, God is not Cain's highest love. Now, when you live in that way, something will go wrong it is wrong, because you are not living the way you were designed to live. And so it is impossible for something to not be wrong, because that is living wrong. And reality is structured in such a way so that when you live wrong, you are on a dangerous, a painful, a suffering path. That's what it means. When you are not walking to God, There's one path to God. If you are walking on any other path that is not leading to God, you are on a suffering path. And that's what it means to say when that Cain's offering was not acceptable, or God had no regard for it. That's what it means. It's just a recognition that Cain is not experiencing the blessing of God because he's not walking to God. The blessing is available. That's what God says. The blessing is available. Just walk this way. Just take this path, and there's the blessing. But if you walk on a different path, the blessing's not over there. So that's essentially that's all this means. The Bible is about love, and you offer to the one you love the most the thing that you offer, that which is most valuable to you. Because that which is most valuable to you is being given to someone. And so if it's not God, then that means you are giving what is most valuable to you to someone that is not God. That may be you. You may be your own God. That is very common. So whatever it is, but as the Bible will point out as we go along, you do not make a very good God. So anyway, so that's what's happening here. By not think of this throughout the Bible. Think of this in your life. What you value the most, you offer to who you love the most. And Cain does not do that, which indicates Cain does not love God the most, which indicates that Cain is walking on a path going to someone that is not God. And that's not a happy path. And so that's why Cain he senses correctly that he is not receiving the blessing of God, because the blessing of God is on a path that he's not walking on. And so he feels that. He gets angry, and God says, why are you angry? You chose what you're receiving. Like, that's what's on the path that you're walking, and you chose to walk on that path. But if you walk on this path, it's available. It's right there. Okay. Now, this next part, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, if you choose a different path, a path that is not God, to God, sin is crouching at the door. Well, that means sin is waiting for you. It's ready to pounce. Well, that's essentially all saying the same thing. Sin is walking outside of alignment with God's will. God's will is to be with us, which means that we will be walking on the path to God. And so if you're off the path to God, there is danger there. In an old map, if you were thinking of this as a literal sort of map, and there's a path to God, God is over here, and there's a path to him, and then like any other path you would have in an old map, you might have there be dragons, that kind of thing. And that's what this is saying. Like, if you get off this path, if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. There are dangers lurking in the bushes on all sides of the path that you're walking on. Temptations, the same, just like with Eve. Sin with Eve and the tree. It was good for food. The beautiful tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was good for food. It was a delight to the eyes, and it was good for wisdom. It's this temptation. That's what this is saying. There is just temptation everywhere. If you're not on the path to God and you don't have the blessing that comes with walking properly, you will not have the strength to push back against that temptation, to reject that temptation. So it's crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. Other translations will say its desire is for you, but we'll get to what that means in a minute. But its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. That's that temptation thing. Its desire is, in other words, the sin, all the temptations are not good for you. They are contrary to you. They are going to pull you away from what you should be doing. And in fact, in some ways, what you may want to be doing. but you are falling prey to temptation. So it's desire. It describes, it's this beautiful way it describes sin. It's crouching. It's this living thing. It's like in the previous chapter, I mentioned how the tree was so tempting. It hit all the parts of the soul, and it was so tempting to Eve. This is doing a similar thing. It's not doing it by talking about the three parts of the soul, but it's doing it in this animalistic, intense, personal way. Sin, sin is crouching at the door. It's like animalistic. It's a beast. It has a desire against you, but you must rule over it. But that gets hard. In other words, but you must rule over it. You must reject the temptation. What Eve was not able to do, and this is the further fall. This is the next generation repeating the falling prey to temptation. You must rule over it. And notice its desire is contrary to you. That's exactly the same. I believe this is the same word that was used for Eve when it said her desire will be contrary to her husband. There will be this conflict, but he will rule over you, right? This is a repeat of that. It's a rephrasing of that line. It's this. I mean, I think that was exactly. Well, let's look back quickly. It's right here. Your desire, it's verse 16 in chapter 3. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And then down here with Cain, its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it, right? So both of these are explorations of temptation and the problems with them. Now, as I said back there with the Eve part in that line, if Adam and Eve were both in alignment with God's will, this would not be true. This is describing the world of temptation and the falling prey. It's a beast crouching at the door, the falling prey to sin and temptation. But if you're in alignment with God's will, that is not true, because your Eve's desire would not be contrary to Adam's. They would both be in line with God's will. They would be the same. And that's what this is saying here with Cain. If you're off the path to God, then you're going to face this conflict. And by the way, of course, don't forget, this conflict is internal. I mean, it may be presented to you through external means, through friends or whatever, may tempt you and so on. But the conflict here, the sin is inside you, right? The temptation is inside you. This battle, you must rule over it. This battle is an internal battle. I mean, it's also an external battle with forces in a corrupt world and in a tempting world and so on. But I mean, fundamentally, in the end, that's what I was talking about yesterday. This is a matter of choice. This is a human. What makes this a moral question, as opposed to mere behavior, is what I was talking about yesterday. We are made in the likeness of God, and so this is an internal battle. And within you, these temptations find their way inside little cracks and crevices of your mind and soul, and they crouch in hidden places, and they crouch, meaning ready to pounce, ready to jump out and tempt you at just the right weak moment, and so on. And it's contrary to you; it's against you. Paul says in the New Testament something like, and we all experience this. He's making a point about our falling prey to temptations. He says something like, I do what I would not. In other words, he does what he does not want to do, and he does not do what he wishes he did do. In other words, he knows what's right, but he falls prey to these temptations, and exactly the thing he knows he shouldn't do, and in fact, he desires not to do it. But this sin crouching in the hidden places and jumping out at the weak moments, you do what you don't even want to do, but you do it, and then you say, "Why did I do that?" That's a human experience, and that's in part what this is talking about here. You do what you do not want to do, and you do not do what you want to do. I should do that, and you don't do it. And so that's what this is. It's just describing this. This is new in the world. I mean, it's common to us, but that's what's being described here. The world is. We've just in the story, mankind has just left paradise. So this is the unfolding, the unfolding of the world that we recognize, and this temptation and sin is gathering a grip on mankind here. Sin and, in other words, death. That's what when we lost access. This is spiritual death, and in other words, that we don't have access to the tree of life, and this spiritual death is deepening and deepening. And in fact, in the next chapter, chapter 5, I may read it briefly, although this is already a lot longer than I thought, but well, yeah, I'll save that. But I think you can see in those begat where people are living so long and then the ages kind of start declining. I think what I gather mostly from that, which I'm kind of giving away the whole main thing I was going to say about that the upcoming chapters, is I think what's being communicated there as the world is being created so that we recognize it. I think what's being demonstrated there is this falling away even further and further from the tree of life, right? They don't have access to it. They're cut off, but as chapters 1 to 11 progress, we get further and further and further away from the tree of life. And that's what's described, that this is the entry, this is the beginning stage of that. This is the first sin outside the garden. And it's, Adam and Eve disobey God, and this is once again a walking away from God, of not living in alignment with God's will. Okay, so let's move on. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Just so beautifully written. So, the Bible is written in this literary way that just communicates so much information, just poetically and beautifully and intensely. Okay. So Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Just mention briefly, this is very much like, once again, this is a repetition. Throughout the Bible, we will really see this in Judges. Throughout the Bible, events sort of repeat themselves, but at deeper and at worse and worse levels, or at better and better levels when the New Testament comes in. But there's this sort of repetition. What's being indicated here, I would say, is something like a repetition, and it's a decline. It's a repetition, but even worse. So this is very similar to how Adam and Eve responded when God questioned them. God knows what happened. He's not asking Cain as though he doesn't know, but he's sort of giving Cain an opportunity here. I mean, this is bad. Cain has just killed his brother out of, some sort of jealousy, because Abel is experiencing some blessing and Cain is not. And so Cain's reaction is not to correct his path. It's not to obey what God just told him. Look, I'm over here. The blessing is right here. Just change your path. Cain did not do that. He chose to kill his brother rather than change his own path. In other words, he didn't want to correct himself. He wanted to get rid of the standard that was showing him his own flaws, right? Abel being there, visible, being blessed, was essentially like a mirror pointing out to Cain his own flaws. And instead of responding with the desire to emulate to Abel, the desire to walk to God and receive what Abel is receiving, he decides to break that mirror, to destroy the standard, to destroy that which is good, rather than to become good, so that it doesn't. This idea will come up throughout the Bible too, that there's a good standard, and what that does is it's a judge. It essentially judges you, because you can see the difference between yourself and that. So when Abel is there, Cain can see the difference between himself and Abel. He can see his own failings. So instead of correcting his own failings, he chooses to destroy that which is good, so that he can become hardened. He can ignore his own failings because he's not seeing something better than him. Hopefully that makes sense. I was going to say, I started by saying something else about that. Cain, just about how this is very similar to the way Adam and Eve responded. God asked them, "What have you done?" And they pawn it off onto each other, Adam onto Eve and Eve onto the snake, onto the serpent. And that's something like what Cain is doing here. He's just acting like he doesn't, it was somebody else. It was something else. He's giving this pitiful childish excuse. But this time you could say the consequences are the sin is in some ways, in a fundamental way, much worse. So, and that's what we will see here. This decline in humanity, just this fall into sinfulness. Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. That is an important line. Blood will play a critical role throughout the Bible. When you see blood, that is life. Blood is life. There's also an interesting, feels to me, when you get used to reading literature like this, the way I was talking about earlier, where just allow the connections that should begin to, you can open yourself up and begin to just automatically feel certain connections when you read words and ideas and so on. Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. To me, that is describing what I was talking about earlier, that reality is created, is structured in such a way that you can't get away with something. Like, it's not possible to get away with something. There is no hiding it. You may think you hide it, and you may hide it from another person or something, but you cannot hide it from reality itself. And therefore, you cannot hide it from God. But that's the same thing, essentially, in the way that I'm meaning this, that you cannot hide it from reality itself. In this way, Abel is dead, but it doesn't change the fact that his blood is crying to me from the ground. You don't have to read that like literally. What that means is what I'm saying here. There's no escaping what you do. When you bring evil into the world, you are now standing in a corrupt place, right? So as I said yesterday, we are made in the likeness of God, and so we take part in the creation of the world. And when you bring into your world evil, when you bring into your world corruption, that's where you are standing. And it's not a geographical thing. I don't mean that, go stand over there. That's not how it works. You have just corrupted your part of the world. Now, the fallen nature of the world that we live in is that, unfortunately, although fortunately, it's all part of a beautiful creation, and it's horrible, but it's the way it has to be and should be when you really go deep into it. But unfortunately, in a way, you do not just corrupt your part of the world. You corrupt the world for the people around you as well. Generally, most closely, that will generally be your family. So in fact, this is coming up. It just happened with Cain, right? We can bring evil into the lives of others. That is the nature of being made in the likeness of God. We have that power. We don't just corrupt our own lives, but when we bring evil into our existence, those who are near us are going to be affected by that as well. And so that's essentially what this means. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. There's no escaping it. There is a line I love from the movie 300. I absolutely love. It's a philosophical line. I do not think it is historical, though it is certainly, it's just a beautiful line. I cannot remember, it's Leonidas is the king, and I cannot remember the deformed guy's name, but it's just such a beautiful line. And it's the same as this, basically, about the blood crying from the ground. Or it's, my mind makes these connections and I say it's the same. It's not the same, but it's related. It feels the same to me. It's a similar concept. It all comes from the same reality. So the deformed guy, they're Spartans, he betrays the Spartans. Betrayal in Christianity, betrayal is like the worst. Betrayal is a bad sin, a very bad sin. And Leonidas curses him. I wish I could think of his name, but I can't remember his name. It's, for some reason I want to say it's something like Mephistopheles. That's the evil character from now I can't even think of that. Paradise Lost? No. Anyway. Um, I'm probably making a bit of a buffoon of myself there with these names, but in any case, the curse, because he is a betrayer now, the curse from Leonidas is something like, it's not pray, I forget exactly what he says, but he says something like, it's not this, I'm not quoting exactly, but he says this: I pray you live forever. Or maybe it's just may you live forever. That's the curse, right? That, to a shallow mind, to someone who doesn't yet understand something like the Bible or deep or philosophy, really deep honorable philosophy or something like that, certainly the Bible. I pray you live forever, may you live forever, is not a blessing, it's a curse. In this case, I mean, it could be in a different situation, but in this case, to a man who has become a betrayer, to say to him, may you live forever, that's like, if you understand how that's a curse, because it's related to this, you can't do this, his blood is crying to me from the ground, meaning you cannot escape the reality you just created. It is not possible. Reality is structured in such a way that you cannot escape it. You have brought it into existence and it is here. That's what that curse means. May you live forever. He is now a betrayer. And that is its own punishment. And to live forever as a betrayer, to be forever tormented as a betrayer, is its own punishment. No matter how much money you have, no matter how much whatever, you are a betrayer. And that's, so the punishment is built into, the suffering, etc., is built into the sin. It's just built into it, and you cannot escape it. Now, Christianity is about redemption, and there will be ways to deal with it, but you have to deal with it. If you do not deal with it, if you do what Cain is doing here, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? If you don't deal with it, that is just more sin, more beasts of sin crouching at your door, kind of thing. Anyway, so that's what's happening here. And it's related to the concept Jesus will say, what good does it do to gain the world and lose your soul? Right? No matter how much money you have in worldly terms, no matter how much wine, women, or song or something for men, no matter how much money or happiness or whatever, what I mean by happiness is laughing, no matter whatever you have, that's, if you lose your soul, which is what happened when he became a betrayer, or here with Cain, this is the spiritual death. This is the real death. So when Leonidas says, may you live forever, he doesn't mean this, he's talking about the physical life. In other words, may you be trapped in this physical life of spiritual death. That's a good way. I never thought of saying it that way, but that's what I'm saying. It's spiritual death that we're talking about here with sin. And yeah, that's exactly it. And so Leonidas, to put it in these sort of more Christianized terms or something, Leonidas is saying, may you be trapped forever in spiritual death. Something like that, as its own punishment, because it is its own punishment. Okay. So, and the Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying. And now you are cursed from the... So now we go through the curses. Just like this is a repetition of the Adam and Eve disobedience and then curses and so on. It's just getting worse and worse and worse, and it will keep getting worse and worse and worse, as we'll see. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. So even it was already thorns and thistles from Adam, and now it's even worse. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. So now you can't even do the farming that Adam was cursed to do. You can't even work by the sweat of your brow, that kind of way. It's even worse. It's this continuing worsening of life due to sin, due to falling prey to temptations and sin. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden." In the previous chapter, man, Adam and Eve, were driven from the garden. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier, Cain is getting driven even further away. So as these 11 chapters progress, we're getting further and further and further from the Garden of Eden, and life is ebbing. Eternal life is ebbing further and further and further away. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay, now interesting. I do not know. To be honest, I have not spent a lot of time thinking about that, but it is a fascinating idea. What is going on there exactly? And I do not think at the moment, I do not want to take time here in the middle of the video to stop and really think about that. But what is being communicated there, I'm not really sure. Now, this idea of vengeance and sevenfold, that is going to repeat itself here in just a minute. And then also other times in the Bible, including when it repeats here in a minute, I will point out another one of those times where it is, as I've been saying, it is reversed in the New Testament. But yeah, so the idea of being fugitive and going further off, I think that you can kind of, I'm sure that there are deeper things to say as I progress in my knowledge and in my wisdom or my understanding, but I think that most of that is just the purpose of this prologue of these 11 chapters. This is all part of developing the world that we're, in order to get it to a point that where we would recognize it. But exactly the part about the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one would kill him, and what that means, interesting. And I'm not sure what to make of that exactly. So we will move on. Cain, so these next couple of stories, I think these are going to go very quickly because they are just the continuing development. I think just pretty straightforward, at least that's how I'm going to treat them here, because I don't think I have a lot of depth here, but it's just the development of this falling away and the worsening and worsening of mankind's actions, behavior. They're falling away further and further from God. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When Cain built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methusael, and Methusael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the other Zillah. Adah bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. So once again, a number of these stories are going to be, we're creating the world that we recognize. You're going to have people who live in tents, people who are farmers, people who are hunters, people who live in cities, etc. That's what's coming up here. And have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe, so the musicians. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, so the metalworkers. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say about this so far. One day I will come back to this. There are some interesting things I would like to understand deeper here. But the surface level thing that's happening here is we're now getting all the occupations, and the cities are coming about and so on. So the development of civilization, something like that. We're going from just these 2 people, Adam and Eve, to civilization. And that will become more explicit momentarily. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Degradation of sin. Cain killed a man, now his descendant Lamech kills a man just for wounding him, whatever that means. I mean, it might make, but anyway, it's clearly seems to be saying, the 77-fold. It's not proportional justice, which will become a major point of the Hebrew law, of the Judaic law as we go along. This proportional justice, an eye for an eye, is we kind of take the idea of an eye for an eye as being something like extreme to our ears. We say it in a way that makes it sound like it's harsh, but it's not. It's not a harsh law. It's a proportionate justice law. An eye for an eye, not a death for an eye. So it's very much a proportionate law, which is what Lamech here is rejecting. He's not proportion. You hurt me, I hurt you 77-fold. 77-fold doesn't mean literally 77 times. It means way more, In other words, it means this. You wound me, I kill you. Okay, so we had the Cain is sevenfold, Lamech is 77-fold. In the New Testament, this is going to be reversed in a way, because Peter, Jesus' disciple, is going to ask Jesus a question one time. He's saying, when my brother, not meaning his literal brother necessarily, but a friend, another person, when my brother sins against me, does something against me, how many times should I forgive him? I think the standard, something like a sort of Hebrew standard for being a pretty good person, was maybe 3 times. You let somebody hurt you 3 times, and then you kind of just say, well, okay, that's enough. And Peter thinks he's at least this is how I remember it at the moment. But I think Peter says to Jesus, should I forgive him 7 times? Peter thinks he's doing well, because it's not the 3 times that the normal society accepts. Look, you forgave him 3 times and he kept doing it, so you're in the right. You don't have to keep forgiving him. He's choosing this. He's choosing the punishment himself now. At this point, he's the societal standard is you forgive 3 times. Peter says 7 times, thinking he's doing well, and Jesus says something like not 7 times, 77 times, 77-fold times, or however he says it, but 77 times, something like that. And it's the undoing of this Lamech, right? So in the Old Testament, we have this fall, this downward trajectory. Cain is avenged 7 times. Lamech is 77 times, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And then in the New Testament, it goes back up. It's 3 times, and then it's suggested, well, what about 7? And then Jesus says, no, 77. So, but it's going in the reverse. It's not vengeance 77 times, it's forgiveness 77 times. So it's the undoing. So the New Testament is the undoing of the Old Testament failures. Okay. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay, so we're done. That was the end of chapter 4. Seth will not play a major narrative role. He's an important role, but he won't take up a lot of words in the Bible. But he is in the story. We need, you need 2 paths. We have the path of Cain, and now we'll have the path of Seth. So the world is going to be redeemed. That is the story of Christianity. And that is going to come about through the line of Seth. But there is also the path of Cain. So the world has... So in other words, we're creating this dichotomy within the narrative. And the story will sort of unfold using that. Now, it will not be... In the Bible, it will not be referenced very much. Like you won't say... There won't be too many times where... In fact, I don't... Well, yeah, there won't be too many times where you say, well, that was the line of Cain and that was the line of Seth. But so yeah, it's not going to play out like that exactly in an explicit way. But narratively speaking, we now have these two approaches, something like those who walk with God and those who do not, which is the fundamental categorization in life. Because there's the one path to God, and then there's every other path, right? The fundamental distinction in how you're living your life is you're either walking to God or you're not. Now, that does not mean that every path is as crooked as every other path, etc. But anyway, we now have these two paths. And it won't be like every descendant of Seth is a great guy. The Bible is nothing like that. It's not a simplistic book. It's nothing like that. But narratively speaking, and just to provide this symmetry and structure and everything in the brilliantly crafted narrative here, we now have these two lines of descent. Seth and Cain. Cain stopped. I know there were some things I wanted to say about the Abel, Cain extinguishing the line of Abel, but anyway. One thing I wanted to point out, and then it's been an hour and a half. I think, you know what? I will stop it in just a moment, and then we will. Because in case I say something wild in chapter 5, because there's not a lot to say, I will put that in a separate video, maybe a very short video. So I will probably stop it here because I'm reasonably satisfied with how chapter 4 went. But I do want to mention one thing. Is this the right time to mention it? Maybe, because this is fundamental to understanding the entire story of the Bible. I know I say that about a lot of things, but we're in the beginning. We're still opening up, getting all these things in place, all these little puzzle pieces in place. It's regarding the picture that I have at the beginning and end of the videos. That is a picture of Jesus on the cross, a particularly brutalistic picture of Jesus on the cross. And the story of the Bible, I know there's a place coming up that where this is going to really apply, but I'll just introduce the idea here, and then I will talk more about it when it really is obviously applicable, directly applicable. It's applicable throughout the Bible. But the reason I chose that picture is because I saw somebody say, I saw Robert Barron, Bishop Barron, that Catholic bishop that I mentioned earlier. He did a series, I think, called Catholicism. I think that's where this was. And I think he was standing in front of that picture, that painting, or referencing it anyway. And I think he quoted someone, and I cannot remember who that was, but that changed everything about the way I view. I mean, that was this line was just so fun, so critical in coalescing my thinking and helping me to understand the Bible and understand everything he said. And I might be getting it slightly wrong, but the meaning was Jesus on the cross. Looking at that picture that I have there, Jesus on the cross is a happy man. So the entire Bible is about how to understand the truth of that statement. Now, look at that picture at the beginning and end of this video. And when you understand the Bible, you will know how obvious, knowing the story of Jesus, you will know what it means to truthfully say, Jesus on the cross, the man you are seeing in that picture, Jesus on the cross is a happy man. The Bible is what teaches you to be truly happy. What that means is truly happy. It does not mean that Jesus is not suffering. He clearly is. That's the reason I chose that image, and probably the reason he chose that image when he said that, when he made that quotation. At least I think he did. I think that's where I got it from. But it's such a brutalistic image. But Jesus in that image is a happy man. But you have to understand what that means. And when you do, you understand the power of it. You understand the power of the Bible. You understand the power of Christianity and what makes it different than other religions. It's what makes it different from everything. It's what makes it beautiful and powerful and just like nothing else. The Bible teaches you, Christianity teaches you how to live a life to find a happiness that is impenetrable, that cannot be broken. And no matter what. In other words, no matter what happens, even in the midst of crucifixion, that's what the Bible does. And because that is, so when I was saying earlier about everything off the path to God is painful, Jesus was on the path to God and he was crucified. So don't mistake what I mean when I say, like, Christianity doesn't mean that if you walk to God, your entire life will be sunshine and lollipops. Jesus, our perfect example, was crucified, is the man in that picture. So it doesn't mean if you won't experience suffering. It does not mean that in any way, shape, or form. But it does mean that. And so when I talk about danger being off the path, I don't mean that those people, that someone off the path to God, they may very well have a lot of sunshine and lollipops, a lot of laughing, a lot of money, a lot of all the other things. I mentioned that in here. That's not happiness. That's not an impenetrable happiness that Jesus is experiencing on the cross. Anyway, so this is a deep sort of seemingly, I guess it is paradoxical, but once you understand it, it's not really paradoxical. So that's to me it's not. But you have to understand. I mean, that's a paradox. You have to, you can understand it at a certain level, and then it's not. But anyway, but that is the paradox. I think there was a point here earlier, at some point in this talk, I think there was a place where I could have brought that up and it was more directly applicable, but it will definitely be more applicable at points in the Bible. So I'll just introduce it here. Like that picture at the start of this has a meaning. Start and end of these videos has a meaning, and the meaning is going to be what you're going to learn, I hope, as we go through all this, is to really understand that Jesus on the cross is a happy man, and that is available to you. That's what God said to Cain. How did he say it? If you do well, will you not be accepted? That acceptance, remember I was talking about love. I don't know how metaphysical we will get in talking about God, although I should. But God is love, which means something. It sounds just like these words I'm saying, but it specifically means something, and I probably should talk about it at some point because it's not just nice sounding words. It's not that at all. It means something. And if you've ever loved, really loved, which many of us, to be accepted by the one you love is essentially that's what you see. That's what Jesus has. He is accepted by the one you love. And you can think of this. There are lots of examples, amazing examples of this where, we have a saying, love conquers all, etc. What Jesus has, regardless of what's going on outside, he has the acceptance of the one he loves. So he loves, and he is loved in return, and that is impenetrable. Like it's just not possible for sin, for death, for evil, for pain in some sense, for suffering. It's just not possible for suffering to penetrate that. Love is, as we will maybe at some point, we will do some metaphysical discussions in here, probably, knowing myself. And we will see that love has to be the highest principle. It has to be the highest virtue. There are a lot of virtues, and they are arranged in a hierarchy. And many things are virtuous. They are good things. They are good habits to have, but they are not the highest virtue. If they are elevated to the highest virtue, if any of those non-love virtues are elevated to the highest point, to the hierarchy, to the top of the virtue hierarchy, something will go wrong. It is only love that can be at the top of the hierarchy. And so when you are in perfect alignment with love, which in Christian terms is going to be just another way of saying when you are in alignment with God's will, as Jesus is as he is there throughout his life, but also including there on the cross, when you are in perfect alignment with love, it is impenetrable in terms of the suffering and so on. It doesn't matter what's outside. You are as strong. You are made in the image and likeness of God, and you have that ability, that power, that everything is. You have access to it. Anyway, as will unfold as we, the understanding of that will unfold as we progress through the Bible, and in some ways in particular, very much in particular when we get to the New Testament and more is revealed through Jesus. Okay, is that it for this one? To Seth was born, his name is Enoch, and and Adam knew his wife again, Seth. To Seth was born and called his name Enosh. Okay, so in the next, you can see here, we will get to more descendants in chapter 5, which will go very quickly because it's really almost completely just listing descendants leading up to the Noah story. At this time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Yeah, so I think that's it. We're leading into the not done properly, but what was mentioned back in chapter 1, multiply and fill the earth. That's what's happening here. The earth is getting filled up, and we're leading into that. Okay, good night for Genesis chapter 4. Hopefully we'll make another Genesis chapter 5 tonight. If not, probably tomorrow. Good night.